May 31, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Death of Owen Hart. By Observer staff. This past Wednesday, I met two children that I had met about 18 months earlier under the absolute worst of circumstances. I'd heard stories about both literally since they were born. They have no father. He died about 18 months ago because in his quest to provide for them by becoming a big star in the wrestling industry, he refused to accept his own physical limitations and ultimately lost all perspective and became a victim of them. He knew he needed to make enough money in the short time his aching body had left so someday he could live a normal life and be around to see his children grow up, although he was sacrificing time in their formative years to reach his ultimate goal. While we can, and should, all rejoice in the entertainment this business has given all of us, it would be a huge tragedy if any of us ever forget the realities of what this business has left us with. Just a few weeks ago I spoke to a mother whose daughter was having her 5th birthday party, one she'll never forget, because it was the first one without her father, who had died 1 week earlier. Exactly what caused his death isn't known at this time, but in some form it was due to his quest to regain past fame for one last run. These men were very good performers, which at this point is irrelevant. If they weren't, it would be no less tragic. But in the end, it was their own decisions, along with pressures put on by themselves and the demands of their profession, that signaled the end of their lives. There are a lot of great individuals in this profession. If there was any question about that, all I can tell you is if you were in Cincinnati, Ohio last week for the Brian Pillman Memorial Show, there were fantastic performers and wonderful human beings who have terribly demanding schedules, most with families, who spent far too little time at home, and smack in the middle of the few days they have off, did something not to get over to anyone, but simply because they are good people. One WWF performer had agreed to come many weeks back. He lives in Florida. At the last minute, his company arranged a public appearance that day in Los Angeles. So in the middle of a swing of just a few days off, he flew all night to Los Angeles, did his appearance, and flew back across the country when he easily could have begged out and nobody ever would have blamed him in the least. Another wrestler, the biggest star in this industry, who in a previous lifetime, was best friends with Brian Pillman and tag team partners with him, and due to his own personal problems and lack of days off, simply couldn't attend. He sent a $10,000 check as a donation, not for any public relations reason, and not for publicity. I saw those two young children with smiles on their faces because of how good so many of the wrestlers were with them, backstage, with no cameras on and few people looking on. And I was able to witness the most courageous person of all, a 97-pound man riddled with cancer, almost embarrassed by the lengthy standing ovation he received in his usually anonymous job as a referee, feeling bad not because his own life expectancy is precarious, but because he was a step slow and got winded faster than he liked doing the job he's going to continue to do until he physically can't step through the ropes anymore. But it was far more important to remember this was one day, and a day of joy can't come close to matching up to a lifetime with the tremendous void that those children are going to grow up with, at least in part because of the business. 4 days later, it's here again. But this was different. Not just because the media, due to the spectacular nature of the story, made this the story as opposed to so many others, which got buried or ignored, which is one of the reasons they keep continuing in an industry where all previous deaths have caused so major changes in applying safeguards, and whose main reaction seems to be to cleverly vilify anyone who brings up these tragedies that are no coincidence. But also because the man who died didn't do so because he went to greater extremes than his body would allow to make it big, and a fatal obsessions to become the superstar politics didn't allow him to be, or to relive those days even though rational thinking would tell them they were over. It was a freak accident. There was no cause. There was no decision made for irrational and dangerous behavior, except, perhaps, not wanting to say the word no and be something less than the model employee that he was. The show must go on. And under the most intense media siege in history for its heartless actions, the greatest tribute wrestling show emerged, and fans could turn off their television sets Monday night happy. And don't forget, Saturday morning on USA, back to business as usual. Except for this large celebrated family that has already endured more than its fair share of tragedies. This is no Von Erich story, where the end result was as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. This was heartache up to this point that had nothing to do with being reckless, stupid, or having bad judgment. So now we present Owen Hart, the father of 2 children, everybody's favorite uncle, the baby of the family, the little prankster who grew up living in the same room, the best friend, the little brother who the big brothers almost lived their athletic goals through because he was the athlete they wanted to be, and the soulmate of someone he met at a high school dance, his first love, who through all the turmoil of life on the road, he never once broke up with. He and they grew up with the cons and around the cons. They know the real score better than any of us. And while we can debate whether they should have gone on with the show on Sunday, or if Owen would have wanted it this way, Or if Monday's show was a true tribute or brilliant attempt at damage control, they know this business. They were this business in their part of the world. They lived this business, both the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows. And they know the truth. It's almost ironic in the sickest of ways. From Owen Hart's first few matches as a full-time pro wrestler in the spring of 1986, it seemed apparent he would achieve great fame and become a pivotal figure in the history of this industry. And he did in a way nobody could have ever been morbid enough to guess. It's also ironic that the most controversial and talked about moments in the history of pay-per-view wrestling up until this weekend involved Owen Hart's brother. The story that rarely a few days would go by before, for one reason or another, it would be talked about. The biggest news story in modern wrestling history, at least in the ring itself. A story that has gone beyond being exploited just within pro wrestling and grown its own life of myths and fabrications and legend, and now it's grown to being exploited in versions of the truth as contrived as any pro wrestling angle in a made-for-television movie. We used to joke about how 30 years from now, somehow in some way, it would keep coming up. I'm sure it would have. And now it's become, in comparison, so utterly meaningless. Sunday, May 23, 7:41 p.m. Central Time, in what will now become the most famous moment of modern wrestling history. Jim Ross was setting to pitch to a pre-taped Owen Hart interview under the mask as the Blue Blazer, and stunned just before the tape ran, said, "We've got a big problem out here." The tape of Owen Hart's last interview ran anyway. Owen Hart was born May 7, 1965. You know the place. You know the house. You've even seen what it looks like on the inside. He was the youngest of a family of 8 boys and 4 girls. All 8 boys became wrestlers. All 4 girls married them. It's definitely not what their mother had in mind. You know all that. He was always around wrestling. It was his father's life. All his brothers did it. Older wrestlers who were superstars of the early 70s tell stories about 5-year-old Owen running barefoot in the snow, or 8-year-old Owen helping older brother Bruce write the wrestling programs, or 14-year-old Owen accompanying big brothers Bruce and Keith to a big show in Honolulu where they played heel against a huge, untalented Samoan tag team in a building with inadequate security and rabid Samoan fans. The brothers, used to playing face at home, were a little too effective playing heel, and a riot broke out. A few attacked Bruce and Keith, who were doing a decent job holding them off. A large adult Samoan fan threw a chair at Keith. Owen, totally undersized, jumped right in the fray and wound up with a black eye. As a child, he shared a room with 3 of his brothers, Ross, who was 5 years older, Brett, who was 8 years older, and Dean, who was 10 years older. But the biggest influence on him was Bruce, 15 years his senior, who taught him the world of practical jokes that among wrestlers he became probably more famous for than even for his considerable ability inside the ring. All his brothers tried wrestling with varying degrees of success. Keith and Bruce went to college first and got their teaching credentials, but wound up working in their father's wrestling business. Brett, who at first never wanted to be a wrestler, one day wound up in the ring and turned out to be pretty good and never stopped. Ross, who probably wanted to be a great wrestler and loved being on the road with the boys more than any of the brothers, but didn't have the athletic ability of his more famous brothers, wound up working more backstage and occasionally wrestling. Owen, growing up, was the best athlete of all the boys and thus became Stu's favorite. He would goof around the ring as a teenager and picked everything up quickly. He never did gymnastics, but one day he decided to do a backflip off the turnbuckles to set up a hip toss spot. He tried it with a spotter once, hit the move perfectly, and never needed a spotter again. It was like that with every move. He grew up seeing legends like the Funk Brothers and Harley Race come through Stampede Wrestling as touring NWA World Champions, and all the great British from Billy Robinson to the Dynamite Kid and young Japanese stars as well, and learned to mix all the various styles and even threw in some lucha libre at a time when nobody in wrestling learned any style other than what was done in their own local territory. As early as the age of 16, under a mask in small towns in the middle of nowhere, since it had to be kept secret to maintain his amateur wrestling eligibility, he'd fill in on shows and his brothers remember him as being a natural. He played varsity baseball, football and wrestled at Ernest Manning High School, becoming City and Alberta Provincial High School champion in 1983 at 165 pounds. By this point he was also watching a lot of Japanese wrestling videotapes that his family would get, since Brett by this time was a major junior heavyweight star there, and Dynamite Kid, the greatest worker in the promotion and possibly the world at the time, was becoming legendary in the Orient. Hart largely studying the matches from the original Tiger Mask, the most innovative high flyer of his era, and later, the Cobra. At a school dance in late 1982, he met Martha Patterson, who he immediately got together with, never broke up with, and eventually married. After graduating high school in 1983, he accompanied brother Ross on a wrestling tour of Europe. Ross was going there as a wrestler. Owen was going there because he had a chance to spend the summer after graduation in Europe. Just before leaving, there was an injury in the crew and Owen, in two small towns in the middle of nowhere, and under a mask to protect both kayfabe and his amateur eligibility, formed a tag team with Dynamite Kid against older brother Brett and a wrestler who I guess will go down as the answer to a trivia question named Gary Eichenhauser. He went as a vacation and, notorious for being a penny pincher and saving his money among the wrestlers, he was more frivolous as a teenager, spending way more than he could afford on phone calls to Martha back home. While on his vacation and while Ross was working for a promoter named Arpad Weber in Germany, and somehow was put in the ring since he'd done it before, and I guess they were a man short, and totally outshined his brother, and they were quickly made a tag team. By the time they went to England for joint promotions, Owen under his real name, since wrestling news from England was hardly in danger of making its way to the collegiate authorities in Canada, was an immediate star after wrestling a classic 40-minute television match against Marty Jones and also feuding with a veteran star named David Fit Finlay. Nobody pushed him into it, remembered Ross. We all knew from the start he was a natural talent. He was never that anxious to make it a career. He just wanted to do it to see how it was. I never had the talent of a skilled wrestler like Owen and Brett, but he always encouraged me and made me feel good. But I was so happy to see him follow Bruce, Brett, and Keith. After a silly Blue Blazer interview, kind of a spoof to make Hulk Hogan look like a dated out-of-touch character, the show went on. Jerry Lawler wasn't there. Unbeknownst to the audience watching on pay-per-view, he ran into the ring immediately because of what happened. The big problem was that Owen Hart, in his Blue Blazer costume, was coming down from a scaffold near the ceiling of Kemper Arena in Kansas City to do a spectacular goofy ring entrance, a spoof on Sting. Somehow, he slipped out of his harness and fell, head first, landing on a turnbuckle, and flipping into the ring. Those at ringside watching said it was clear he had a broken neck. Many in the audience thought it was a crash test dummy, and part of the show. The cameras were on the crowd, standing, in stunned silence. They wouldn't shoot anywhere near the ring. Ross said that something went terribly wrong. This is not part of the entertainment portion of the show. This is as real can get, a line that may become the single most famous line uttered at a pro wrestling event in modern history. This is not a wrestling storyline. As EMTs feverishly tried heart massage, those at ringside could hear the panics because he had no pulse. He was changing color rapidly. First he went white, then gray, then purple, and finally blue. Jim Bradbury of the Kansas City Fire Department said he was killed instantly. They tried mouth-to-mouth. They tried to put an oxygen mask on. As they showed the crowd never once getting a shot of the EMTs working on Hart, fans at ringside in the building could see Ross teary-eyed as his face was off camera, and they rushed to show another promotional video for the Jeff Jarrett match which followed. Some still thought this was all part of the show. Lawler, with his face white as a ghost, came back to the broadcast location. As people who know Jerry Lawler would attest, even when he's out of character, he's always on and somewhat in character. Not this time, as he somberly said, it doesn't look good at all. Hart was wheeled backstage on a stretcher. Not another word was said again about it on television for another hour. Nothing was ever said to the live audience at Kemper Arena the rest of the night. Owen Hart, the teenage pro sensation in England, it's a secret, returned home for his freshman year at the University of Calgary. He was studying for his teaching credential, following in the footsteps of brothers Bruce and Keith, both of whom at the time were wrestling for Stampede. He was a very good college wrestler, and in fact, was never once pinned in 3 years of collegiate varsity competition, although he lost a few matches, mostly via close decisions. While he was a sophomore in college, Vince McMahon decided to become the only wrestling promoter in North America, if not the world. It was a goal McMahon actually never came close to achieving, but in his attempt, succeeded to a level far greater than any of his competitors would have dreamed. Some territories he bulldozed. A few he avoided until later. And a few he tried to buy, and was rebuffed. The only one who took him up on his offer was Stu Hart. He was 68 years old and, unlike many of his compadres who wound up out of business, knew he didn't have the money or the strength to fight McMahon to keep his territory, as he had fought so many others to form it and maintain it over the previous 25 years. The two agreed to a deal where McMahon would pay Hart $100,000 per year for 10 years, plus hire Stu as his local promoter for shows in Calgary and Edmonton, with Stu getting 10% of the gate in each city. As part of the deal, Stu talked Vince into giving a job to his three biggest stars, his son Brett, his future son-in-law Davey Boy Smith, and Dynamite Kid. All three were already stars in Japan, with Dynamite on the verge of being a legend. Kid and Smith lasted only a few weeks, with no push, in the WWF before quitting to take a deal with All Japan. They ended up back several months later, this time with a push, and become forevermore known as the British Bulldogs. Brett stayed and in the beginning, also got no push. According to Bruce Hart, it didn't take long for McMahon to renege on the annual payments, and because the deal was off, although remaining with a business relationship with Titan Sports and continuing to promote and get a cut of the house show gates in the area, 1 year later Stampede Wrestling was reopened. As a sophomore, Owen went to the Chow, Canadian Collegiate Amateurs Nationals and placed third at 177 pounds. When he considered going into pro wrestling, his father strongly discouraged it. Stu loved pro wrestling, but as a great amateur himself and a two-time national champion in the late 30s, he was a total aficionado for what was real and wanted one of his sons to achieve the goal he never did, wrestle in the Olympics, because Stu's prime was when the Olympics were cancelled due to World War II. Everyone knows the stories about him stretching big weightlifters and football players downstairs in the famed dungeon. Stu wanted his sons to be tough guys and great amateurs, but they simply weren't, at least on that level. He wanted Brett, also a provincial champion, to continue on as an amateur and fulfill Stu's dream of going to the Olympics, but Brett gave up amateur wrestling after high school. Owen would be the last son. During his junior year he placed second in the Chow Nationals at 177 pounds in 1986, but after that season, it had already been decreed that the University of Calgary was shutting down its wrestling program and Owen would be off scholarship. A few weeks later Owen Hart, without a mask, under his own name, and in his hometown of Calgary, made his pro debut, and was an instant success. The show must go on. Yeah, right. This was an issue hotly debated by wrestling fans, who vehemently argued both sides. In the real world, just the idea that fans would think that there even was a decision to be made emphasized their view of just how sick a profession this must be. The WWF was brutalized in the media far worse than any period in its history over the next few days by people shocked at what was perceived as the callous disregard for human life. There are arguments that can be made in both directions. But in examining them, the case for continuing gets weak. But this was a snap decision under an incredible amount of stress. I can accept acknowledging the possibility that continuing the show was a wrong decision made under stress, although the public at large wouldn't have accepted that much, and after-the-fact apologies in wrestling usually constitute total insincerity. There are precedents on both sides of the equation. The 1972 Olympics weren't cancelled when the Israeli athletes were massacred. And there have been auto races that have continued after a driver has been killed. Most other sports, both pro and college football, baseball and basketball have set precedents that games don't continue if a participant dies on the field. It's short of sick to think they would. A few years back in an opening game in Cincinnati, an umpire dropped dead of a heart attack and the game was cancelled, which infuriated Reds owner Marge Schott because she had to give back a huge opening day gate. But even those arguments in both directions don't hold because by its own admission and its own attempt to categorize and position itself as an entertainment spectacle, pro wrestling is not a sporting event. People train their entire life for one shot at the Olympics and no matter what, you can't take that away from them, even though our president in 1980 did just that. If a play, a variety show or a concert has one of its key performers die early in the show right in front of the crowd, would the show continue? It's not even an arguable point. Granted, there are millions of dollars at stake in a show like this, which also makes it unique in entertainment. Paul Heyman told me that under the circumstances, he'd have kept the show going. Eric Bischoff on The Larry King Show hemmed and hawed and wouldn't give a straight answer, but said that he couldn't say that he would stop the show. But Paul Heyman is a small-time operator surviving at times hand-to-mouth, and I'd be sympathetic to his position. He very well may in the same position have had no economic choice. Bischoff and McMahon are different. There is already a precedent a few years back at the infamous WWF Beware of Dog pay-per-view show. Due to weather conditions and a power failure, several of the matches didn't take place. They redid the missing part of the show 2 days later. No doubt they took a hit, but that was also because they refused to redo the very disappointing main event that did air on the Sunday because it would have meant having to come up with a new finish. But would anyone have really complained aside from the most callous and the most selfish if they simply announced the show was over due to the tragedy, but would be rescheduled for Tuesday? It's not like they canceled the scheduled show on Tuesday in Mourning. And why was the death not announced at all to the live crowd in the building? And why did the announcers distinctly, except for one brief mention of Hart's death 1 hour after it happened, never mention his name and his condition, or say anything about him or give more details on the situation to a stunned television audience for the rest of the show? Just before all this was going on in front of the fans at Kemper Arena, and being somewhat hidden from the rest of the world, with Ross claiming they didn't want to sensationalize what was happening, admittedly this was a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for those 5 minutes, backstage something else was going on. Vince McMahon was setting up a scene where he'd be on a stretcher, and be begrudgingly taken to the hospital in an ambulance. McMahon was put in the ambulance while Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe did their comedy routine and driven away. Just as it was pulling out and after the scene was cut, Bruce Pritchard screamed that the ambulance needed to come back. Even though doing a mock angle where McMahon would be taken out on an ambulance after Hart had just died would be in the worst possible taste, it was also in the script, and apparently nothing, certainly not good taste and apparently not even death, was going to make them alleviate key points in the show. Owen and Bruce were supposed to become the headline tag team for Stampede. As it turned out, Bruce blew out his knee and needed major surgery and was out for 10 months. A brother-in-law, Ben Bossarab, filled in and formed a team with Owen and they quickly became the International Tag Team Champions, forming a still legendary feud against the masked Viet Cong Express, Hiroshi Hazi, who like Hart, Jun Akiyama and Jumbo Tsuruta and perhaps no other wrestlers of the past 25 years, all four of whom, maybe not coincidentally, were great amateurs and supernatural athletes, was already great worker in his first pro match, and Fumihiro Nikura, who was actually even better than Hazi at the time, but whose career went nowhere because several months later he suffered a heart attack and it was never the same. The teams were having the best matches in North America, and Hart was within a few weeks of his debut already the biggest star in the company. He was sensational from day one, recalled Bruce. He had all the moves, and the timing and psychology. We had a great crew in here with the Viet Cong later, Keiichi Yamada, Jushin Liger, Shinya Hashimoto, Brian Pillman, Jason, Carl Moffat, and Barry Orton. It all started clicking. The two teams fought many lengthy matches over the tag team titles, which later led to Hart vs. Hazi under a mask as a feud which was reprised in New Japan the next year when Hazi returned to Japan as the top junior heavyweight in the promotion and brought in Hart as his favorite opponent for several tours, including a brief period when Hart held the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title, the first foreigner ever to hold it, and one of only three, the others being Chris Benoit and Sabu in history ever to hold it. Hart had only been a pro for a few months, but his reputation as already one of the most spectacular wrestlers in the business began spreading, largely due to this newsletter and a little due to word of mouth among videotape traders. The WWF offered him a deal after he was brought in for a weekend tour in California and stunned everyone with his work under the name Owen James, because they didn't want to acknowledge his kinship with Bret. The money was tempting, but he turned it down, wanting to spend the weekends with his girlfriend. After a 7-minute delay in the broadcast for Hart to be taken out of the ring, of all people, Jeff Jarrett and Deborah Marshall McMichael, who had been working for months with Owen as a tag team combination, were to go on next. Jarrett's back was toward the camera, and when he turned around, you could see something really bad in his face. Fans at home at this point probably figured it was real and it was bad, especially when Deborah then started crying, but didn't know how bad, even though Hart was dead. The match went on. Forgive everyone for it not being any good. The fans live were still in a state of shock, not knowing what was and wasn't real. After a short match, at 8:01 p.m. Central Time they inserted the pre-taped feature of Vince going out in the ambulance. Eventually, upon prodding from Bret, Davey, Dynamite, and Jim Neidhart, Owen changed his mind and went to the WWF as a masked high flyer, patterned it after Tiger Mask. Vince called him the American Eagle, the Blue Angel, the Blue Demon, the Blue Laser, and finally settled on the Blue Blazer, which later became joked on the inside with him being known as the Blue Sports Coat. Although he got over very strong initially with his spectacular work, particularly with young children, the company didn't have eyes for a guy who was 5'9" and 210 pounds. He got no push and eventually fans caught on that he wasn't a star and he started losing heat, and then started jobbing. Many times he came close to quitting, both because he wanted to spend more time with his girlfriend at home, because he felt his development as a wrestler was going backwards, and because he didn't like how he was being used. His father would always tell him to stick it out. Eventually he suffered a serious testicle injury after being head-butted when Greg Valentine didn't duck low enough on a leapfrog spot at the Survivor Series on November 24, 1988 in Richfield, Ohio. When he returned, his slowed-down push was stopped. At the time he was rooming on the road with Ultimate Warrior. The two came in at about the same time in Jim Hellwig, with a monster push and limited ability, but over amazingly strong in the era of the steroids. Hart finally decided to quit. At the time Hellwig was also wanting to quit as well and work full-time in Japan as Hart was talking about doing. Hart figured between the money he'd saved since the promotion pays hotels and travel is taken care of in Japan and he'd have more time off the road, he'd actually come out of the year with the same money for less days away from home and he'd have more fun having good matches in the process. But Hart convinced Hellwig that Japan isn't for everyone and he'd be better off staying put. Hart at this point wrestled his way around the world and became, along with Chris Benoit, perhaps the only expert at every style of wrestling, with stops back home in Stampede in between tours of Germany and Austria for Otto Wanz, New Japan and also Mexico for the UWA, where he arrived as the Blue Blazer and made a big in-ring hit before losing his mask at El Toreo in Naucalpan to connect. He had classic matches, both in this incarnation and the previous one with the top New Japan junior heavyweights like Hazi, Jushin Liger, Shiro Koshinaka, Nobuigo Takada, Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit and Kunyaki Kobayashi. In August of 1989, after Davey Boy Smith, Chris Benoit, Jason the Terrible and Ross Hart were injured in an auto accident, Owen took Smith's place in the company's headline feud against Dynamite Kid, in what are remembered as Kid's last great singles matches. WCW finally brought him in for a few weeks in 1991. After a few weeks, he was offered a contract to form a tag team called Wings with Pillman, but didn't feel that the style suited him and he saw through the cliques and didn't see where he'd have a spot, so he turned down the offer and went back to Germany. Owen grew up ribbing. It wasn't something learned while being a pro wrestler. He learned from Bruce and maybe from hanging around with the older wrestlers when he was still a kid. He was already pulling ribs on everyone when he was a college wrestler, and the generally harmless pranks continued throughout his pro career. Pillman, who started his career a few months later after getting cut from the Stampeders football team after suffering an ankle injury, and wound up teaming with Bruce when he recovered as Bad Company, was also a notorious ribber. The stories of both in their early Calgary days are almost legendary in that part of the country. Pillman used to make life miserable for a lot of the younger, more naive guys, none more so than the one-time real-life strongest man in the world, Bill Kazmaier, who Pillman used to call Quagmire, a name that stuck among all the boys. But a few times Owen got the better of Pillman. They were working a little town in the middle of nowhere. Pillman, a notorious playboy, had a date with some hot babe in Kelowna, where the crew was headquartered for 2 days. Kelowna was the nearest city, about 1 hour from the town they were wrestling in. When he got to the house show, Owen told Bob Johnson, the company road agent, to tell Pillman the company had him booked to do a Say No to Drugs speech and the address he was given was a local senior citizen center. Pillman came to do his guest appearance at about 10:30 p.m., at a time when lights were out at the rest home and everyone was sleeping. Somehow Johnson and the Harts convinced them to let them in to give their speech because the elderly people all watched wrestling. Pillman, furious on the inside, was telling a group of elderly people in their 70s and 80s about stay away from crack while it was long past their bedtime. Owen and Bruce snuck out and drove to Kelowna without him, forcing him to hitchhike his way back to his hotel room. They got into Pillman's hotel room first and gimmicked it up to the max, right out of a bad movie scene. They put a dog in his bed, grabbed his Bad Company wrestling attire and dressed the dog up in it. They put the proverbial bucket of water on top of the bathroom door and unscrewed all the light bulbs in his room. Pillman came to the room furious, as it was past last call and his date, thinking he stood her up, was gone. He kept flipping light switches, stumbled around, got doused with the water when he opened the bathroom door, jumped on the dog which in the dark room he may have felt was the girl he was going to meet, who freaked out and ran off. There was a joke the next several months whenever they came to Kelowna they would look on the side of the road for a dog running around in Bad Company attire. Owen used to do imitations and one of his favorite ribs was to imitate a famous wrestler or celebrity and call his dad up from the road. After 5 or 6 minutes into the conversation, he'd crack up and Stu would start yelling at him in the single most imitated voice ever in the wrestling business. At the late March television tapings at the Meadowlands, Hart locked from the outside the WWF computer techs in their room. I saw very little of the next 3 matches, between phone calls that never stopped, from shocked readers to reporters watching the show, to wrestlers from other companies and then people who hadn't even watched the show but were getting calls from other friends, who wanted to know if I thought it was a shoot or work. After seeing Ross face the first time after the incident, there was zero doubt in my mind, but wrestlers are trained not to believe anything and were arguing it was a sick ratings ploy. Hart was rushed to Truman Memorial Hospital where he was technically confirmed as dead on arrival. A reporter told me to call the hospital, where they said they would release a statement at 9 p.m. which from the words sounded like he was dead, and they did confirm massive internal injuries from a 50-foot fall. Over the 1-hour period, in the conversations, almost like this weird jinx, I was afraid of paralysis, but didn't even want to think of or use the word dead. At 8:40 p.m. Central Time, the camera was back on Ross. I dialed a Hart family friend who wasn't watching the show but I had promised to call the minute I heard anything, and just looking at his face and before Ross said a word, I remember saying, Ross is going to announce that Owen's dead. In 29 years as a wrestling fan, I have a feeling that next moment will wind up 40 years from now as being the most vivid moment I will ever have watching pro wrestling. When Vince McMahon in 1997 before a pay-per-view announced the death of Brian Pillman, it was more of a shock like being hit by a truck and is more a memory of this whirring blur that lasted for about 1 week and I still have no idea how I ever got an issue out. Hearing it while watching television that is supposed to entertain you is somehow far more dramatic than the all too frequent phone calls. Why this was that different from the news about Pillman, I have no idea, but it was. The 1 hour to mentally prepare for the news made it that much worse. They went right to a pre-produced video package of the Hunter vs. Rock feud, showing Rock being put in a casket and Hunter smashing the casket into smithereens with a sledgehammer, and later showing Rock come out backstage from the casket covered in blood. I was watching all that and didn't see any of it. A second later another phone call came, from someone absolutely shocked. They showed the video of Hunter destroying the casket and Rock covered in blood. It wasn't until later that night, reviewing the video, that I actually could comprehend what the person was calling about. From this point forward, the phone calls came literally 1 second apart for the rest of the night, usually people in disbelief that they didn't stop the show. I was spaced out. Everyone making the decisions had to be spaced out. I figured it was a multi-million-dollar show and canceling the show wasn't going to bring him back. And then I thought about that initial cold business reaction and just how sick it really was. I'm convinced now it was a terrible decision to continue. But my head wasn't clear enough until about 2 a.m. to where I even fully realized what a terrible decision it was. Even then, I had no idea just how big this story was going to be played and just how much the company was about to be crucified mainstream for the decision. In late 1991, Owen returned to the WWF just as Bret was becoming a major star, and quickly was wearing suspenders and baggy clown pants, forming a tag team with Coco were called High Energy. Going back to the WWF was not his first choice of a lifestyle. He had gotten married to Martha on July 1, 1989 and bought his first home. The two went together on a lengthy German tours, which they loved, because it was so many days straight playing in the same city, so during the day was almost like being on vacation, and the job had very little stress, and Ottawans treated him very well. He tried to get into the Calgary Fire Department, with the idea that would be his steady job since Stampede Wrestling was closing down, and he'd continue to do Japanese tours, but couldn't get on. So with mixed emotions at first, he went back to the WWF. A few years earlier at a television taping at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, they had attempted to put the two together as a team when Hart was still the Blue Blazer, an idea that was quickly dropped, although Hart felt totally embarrassed in the ring with his Blue Blazer outfit on, flapping his arms and dancing after the match to a song called Bird, Bird, Bird. That team went nowhere the second time as well. Owen was stuck in openers, except for a period where they put him with Jim Neidhart as the new Hart Foundation with a medium push, since Bret had long since outgrown being a tag team wrestler and was being groomed for a top singles slot with the company. Finally, Bret, who originally didn't want to do the Family Feud idea again because he wasn't happy doing it so publicly a few years earlier with Davey Boy, even though they produced one of the WWF's all-time classic matches at Wembley Stadium. Eventually he relented and they did the angle, starting at a Survivor Series match where Keith and Bruce were brought in, and Stu was put at ringside, to team with Bret and Owen against Shawn Michaels, replacing Jerry Lawler, who a few weeks before the show was indicted in a statutory rape case he was later exonerated in, and 3 masked wrestlers, who wound up being Jeff Gaylord, Barry Horowitz, a last-second replacement for Terry Funk who decided he didn't want to be unmasked and flew home just before the show, and Greg Valentine. Owen lost the only fall for his team, but ended up turning on the entire family. For months, somewhat similar to Undertaker vs. Kane but a lot more realistic, they teased a breakup with Bret refusing to wrestle him, and teased being put back together, to set up their first meeting with Bret putting Owen over at WrestleMania X on March 20, 1994 at Madison Square Garden in the opening match on the show. One of his 2 or 3 best matches ever in the company and among the greatest bouts in company history. A show which later ended with Bret winning the WWF title from Yokozuna. This with him beating Bret just hours before Bret won the title, left Bret vs. Owen as the big summer feud in the WWF. This was a period where WWF business was in the toilet, but the Bret vs. Owen house show run after WrestleMania for the title did the biggest house show run of business the company did since the bottom fell out in 1992. Once Bret won those first rematches, subsequent third matches didn't do so well and Owen fell from the top of the card, but as a heel, maintained a good position for the next several years. It was really Owen's only singles house show run on top. To further push him as Bret's top contender, he won the King of the Ring on June 16, 1994 in Baltimore with wins over Tatanka, 1-2-3 Kid and Razor Ramon. The big blow-off was a cage match which went 32-17. That was the best cage match the company ever presented on pay-per-view until the famous Shawn Michaels Undertaker match, with Bret winning on the first event ever at the newly built United Center in Chicago for SummerSlam on August 29, 1994. The feud was somewhat kept alive when Owen talked Mother Helen into throwing in the towel for Bret, costing him the WWF title at Survivor Series on November 23, 1994 in San Antonio in a match with Bob Backlund, a few-day transitional champion before the Diesel reign. Over the next few years, Owen worked mainly as a tag team wrestler, teaming first with Yokozuna and later with Davey Boy Smith as a championship heel team with Jim Cornette as manager, before Cornette was phased out of the picture and Brett went heel, leading to the Hart Foundation's role in the Canada vs. USA feud in 1997 that turned the company's house show fortunes completely around and established Austin as a great babyface drawing card. Owen was a major singles player, with Brett the top heel but missing time with knee surgery. He won the Intercontinental title on April 28, 1997 from Rocky Maivia. Before he was simply The Rock. In an infamous incident at SummerSlam on August 3, 1997 in East Rutherford, New Jersey, he accidentally put Austin's head too low on a tombstone piledriver attempt a few minutes before the scheduled finish. Austin was temporarily paralyzed and for a few moments was scared he'd never walk, let alone wrestle. Hart still managed to unconvincingly pin himself as per the plans, and Austin gained the title back. With Austin on the shelf due to the injury, Hart was given the title back, beating Farouk in a tournament on October 5, 1997, leading to Montreal, where just before the real famous match that night, Austin returned to the ring for the first time since the injury to win the title from Hart in a quick brawl. So wrestling is now mainstream, and wrestling has had its first front-page super headline tragedy. A news story that was 20 times bigger than Jesse Ventura being elected governor of Minnesota. For the first time in history, a pro wrestling event was the biggest item of conversation on sports talk shows. People wanted answers as to what happened, and more importantly, why. The explanation that has been released wasn't unexpected. Owen, it is said, accidentally pushed the release button that his apparatus was equipped so there wouldn't be the clumsy unhooking that Sting and the other guys have to do in WCW, while being anywhere from 50 to 96 feet in the air, depending upon which story you are led to believe, and fell straight down. There is no way to know that isn't true. The people who hooked him up for the stunt are not about to say that they didn't fully hook him up, whether they did or didn't. Clearly, the rope cord he was to be lowered from didn't break. Maybe he was up there and did push the wrong button. Maybe he wasn't hooked up right, stepped off the catwalk, and immediately plunged to his death. The only one who knows that would have any reason to tell the truth at this point is dead. We'll never know anymore unless someday a Magruder tape from the stand shows up, but the odds of them focusing on the ceiling and knowing what was coming are astronomically small. In death, the story has become that Owen wanted to get out of WWF in the wake of the second biggest news story in the history of wrestling on pay-per-view. His brother Bruce said that Owen was really caught in the middle. He had no decision that he could make, because Vince McMahon wasn't going to let him out of his contract. Feeling with Brett gone, Owen would be more valuable as a babyface than before. It was inevitable that he would return, and have a big money feud with Shawn Michaels, and probably be a bigger star than ever before. But that didn't happen either. Michaels didn't put him over at first, which is WWF champion, but also holding the European title belt, which meant he had something to give, and then got hurt at the Royal Rumble, basically ending his career except for the WrestleMania title loss to Austin. The only logical angle for his return after going on a 7-week hiatus in the wake of you-know-what. Because of that would have been with Michaels, who was out of the picture and being saved for one last match with Austin, or McMahon, who wound up saving himself for Austin, which was the right business move. Hart wound up returning for a great revenge angle for his brother who wasn't there, but the people who did it to his brother in real life weren't going to work with him. With no angle, his initial huge pop faded very quickly. With no program, he turned back heel and joined the Nation for a while, to be on the same level with Rock, but Rock had so much more charisma that Hart's star faded as quick as Rock's climbed. He was floundering, a solid in-ring performer in a world where that was mattering less and less. He was hooked up with Jeff Jarrett, another wrestler whose career was falling to a similar plight, and the former Deborah McMichael, who was really the star of the team, opening her blouse and showing sexy bras on television, and stripping to her bikini or lingerie on pay-per-view. The other story going around is that Owen was getting ready to retire from wrestling when his current contract expired in 2 more years. Certainly, he had told many people that. At the same time, even brother Bruce, who has been around wrestlers all his life, said that every wrestler says 2 more years, but when the big money is waved in their face, few really walk away. Maybe Owen would have been the exception. People joked about how tight he was. On Raw, the wrestlers were talking about how little he spent on the road. Maybe at the age of 36 he would really go home, finish college to get his teaching credential, get a normal job and have a nice quiet life, and get to see his children grow up. Name one wrestler, who without the decision forced by injury, who has actually done that. What does any of this hanging from the ceiling have to do with wrestling? The answer is that wrestling is what the fans make it. Whatever is marketable under the umbrella of wrestling is wrestling. It can be psychotic hardcore or brilliant athletics. It can be great in shape athletes, fat unathletic slobs, or bodybuilding stiffs, depending upon who the public buys. Wrestling fans have always been maligned, but never more than the past few days. As in the past, Some is fair, and some isn't. Newspaper quotes in every local paper around the country from wrestling fans show that the stereotype does exist. This incident may not hurt the popularity of wrestling, and may even rally wrestling fans closer against a society that they believe misunderstands them. But for the general public, this blow took years away from all the progress wrestling has made as far as mainstream acceptance and respectability. It's mainstream. It's too big not to be. And it's too big to be ignored. And it's not going away because of this incident. But instead of being viewed as a great entertainment form, a harmless fun soap opera that boasts great demographics, and that the rich as well as the stereotypical poor enjoy, this was a blow so huge from a perception standpoint it can't be described. The fans are getting the blame as bloodthirsty maniacs, wanting their television heroes not to entertain them with wrestling matches, but literally maim themselves with unsafe stunts. The promoters are callous and uncaring, totally lacking compassion and understanding of the real world. Some of these perceptions, sadly, are more true than most of us would like to admit. And it's sad because of how often wrestling fans throughout the years have had to defend their side, and for the first time ever, the tide had almost completely turned to where promoters weren't sleazy, they were brilliant marketing geniuses, where fans weren't sleazy and stupid, they were the target demographic group for advertisers. It wasn't a business for the lowest common denominator, which in some places it was and at other times in other places it never was, but was still perceived as such. All those years of work took a major hit because a man died, totally needlessly, the show went on, and because too few people are secure enough or humane enough to suggest that it very likely was a huge mistake. The wrestlers, thankfully, at least the major league stars, are being regarded as great entertainers and great athletes for the first time ever, but more than ever before, pawns of an ugly system with no insurance, no collective bargaining, and unsafe working conditions. Some are perceived correctly as surprisingly learned, compassionate people who are trying to entertain to the whims of their buying public, but as part of a spectacle with no morals. In media appearances in recent days from so many people in and around the business, they look sad, which they are, exhausted, which many are well beyond, and aside from a few like a Bert Sugar who are totally out to lunch, or Eric Bischoff, who fumbles when he's under pressure in an interview, they don't come across particularly badly talking about their craft within the confines of the highest profile news shows in the so-called civilized world. A few weeks ago, Owen Hart was given his newest angle by the WWF creative team. He was supposed to get a crush on Deborah, and feud with a jealous Jarrett. He turned it down, not wanting to put his wife and children through what they would have to go through. It's funny they asked, because a family precedent was set years ago when Davey was going to get a major singles title challenger push against Shawn Michaels based on an angle where they'd lead the audience to believe Michaels and Diana were having an affair. Brett and Davey both immediately put the nix on that one. So they decided to revive the Blue Blazer, an angle they did a few months ago and had gotten rid of, but with a new twist. The Blazer would be the nerd who represented the enemies of the WWF. The uncool people who said WWF had gotten too raunchy. And also to mock the old Hulk Hogan, say your prayers, eat your vitamins and drink you milk. Kind of a modern-day Bob Backlund character, but one that could actually do something inside the ring. Maybe they were grooming him for a senatorial seat in today's environment. He considered it as his punishment. He was the office rib on their enemies, but he was going to have a good time playing the role anyway. Undertaker won the WWF title from Steve Austin when Shane McMahon fast-counted Austin in the main event of the pay-per-view show. Even the WWF recognizes at this point by almost ignoring the mention of its own title change on its pay-per-view show the next night on Raw that nobody was ready to care about any pro wrestling angles just yet. There is no question that Owen Hart wasn't at all comfortable in doing the entrance planned for him. He had done it once or twice when they did the Blazer gimmick a few months back. They tested the apparatus out twice before the show started, once with Owen himself and the second time with a large sandbag. But he had complained to his wife about it, and she strongly told him she didn't want him doing it. He told other friends, but it is unclear if he ever told anyone in management. Sting did something similar dozens of times over the past few years, but not exactly the same. The Sting descents were safer as he was very tightly hooked up. It made for some real clumsy landing setting up brawls when the 10 heels he was supposed to beat up had to stand there with their thumbs up their ass while he had to unhook himself. There was unprecedented news coverage to any event in the history of pro wrestling to this story. Hart's autopsy listed the cause of death as bleeding to death internally from blunt chest trauma. The Kansas City Area Occupational Safety and Health Administration is looking into whether it has jurisdiction to investigate. 3 men were on the catwalk at the Kemper Arena at the time of the accident. The WWF hired them from the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees Local 31 to work with WWF officials that had worked in putting on that stunt previously. EMTs and the ambulance were at the scene, when normally they are not at WWF events. because they were asked to participate in the angle involving McMahon. Just as they finished the filming and were about to leave, Hart fell and they were called back in. If there is one thing that is loud and clear, it is the furor by the family itself. Understandable when the brother, son, or favorite uncle dies for absolutely no reason. The disgust in many of their voices over the show continuing leaves no room for misinterpretation. We just assumed they would stop the show if it was as serious as it was. When they didn't, we all wondered why that didn't happen. Said Ellie, Jim Neidhart's wife, to the Associated Press. I know my brother Owen, being the kind of person he was, would have wanted Vince to continue. That's the nature of wrestling, but I think it was something that should have been stopped. Many of the brothers and sisters, in interviews with us, major news organizations and on television shows throughout the world, have blamed the ratings war and the need to do more spectacular stunts for the death of their brother. I was even more furious after watching that sanctimonious crap on television. Monday night, said Bruce, who did say he thought Mick Foley and Jeff Jarrett were totally sincere, that some others were and others weren't at all. Vince was trying to absolve his own conscience and I thought it was a fucking travesty. I felt it was heartfelt from some of the wrestlers. I thought that they had the show at all was tasteless. There was also furor in the family about how Vince handled the situation with Stu. Titan claimed that it didn't announce the death for nearly an hour because they wanted to get through to all family members. However, Bruce said that it wasn't until 11 p.m. that evening Mountain Time, or 2 hours after the completion of the show, that anyone from Titan called Stu, and that was Carl DeMarco, president of WWF Canada. Martha was called by Titan almost immediately after the incident. Bruce said he told off DeMarco saying that Vince should have had the guts to call himself. Vince did call 90 minutes later and Bruce said his conversation and voice tone talking about the WWF being their extended family insulted him even more because it sounded like he was doing a promo for wrestling marks. They've lost sight of what the business is, he said. It's become nothing but a fucked up contest for ratings. You don't see John Elway or Wayne Gretzky coming from a balcony. I told him, Vince, what they did was completely senseless. As far as I'm concerned, it's on Vince McMahon and Vince Russo's head and whoever else perpetrated it and put it together. After seeing the generally highly touted, except by more than you'd think within the business who had a totally divergent view Raw show on Monday night, Bruce said everyone in our family was disgusted. The wrestlers were mostly heartfelt. Nobody at the house missed that it was Vince McMahon damage control. The show was all about making Vince feel good about himself and not facing the fact that they just killed somebody. It was the same total bullshit as what they did with Pillman's wife. He's lucky they haven't broken Mankind or Terry Funk's neck. It really makes me sick that he was trying to turn it into a celebration. It takes all the focus off that they killed somebody and now he's trying to turn it into a celebration and the poor brainwashed marks will feel better because they're celebrating someone's life instead of having to be pissed off about somebody's death. And now they're putting all the heat on Owen, how he pushed the release button himself. It's an easy cop-out and that'll be that and they can go on with the show. I was moved by some of the boys, particularly Mankind and Jeff Jarrett. They were legit. The foundation of the show wasn't and it was done to take the focus away from what happened. Ross was very upset the pay-per-view went on, but wasn't as vociferous about the Raw show, saying only that he appreciated parts of it. McMahon taped television on Monday in St. Louis as a 2-hour tribute to Owen Hart, hyped throughout the day in the mainstream media, which short quick matches with no angles, all clean finishes, no run-ins, no risque behavior, no hype or storylines, and filled with one wrestler and office personality after another talking in almost reverent terms about Owen. Many visibly broke down. It appeared the vast majority of the wrestlers were sincere and the show was lauded by the majority who saw it. A few of the tributes, Billy Gunn and Rock in particular, came off as really tacky and underscored too much was self-serving. One company wrestler did say they felt so much of it was phony with people who didn't like him saying how much they loved him and how they were like family. Virtually all talked about his legendary ribbing, how he made working with the company a happier environment, how he spent so little money on the road and his devotion to his family. A few mentioned his in-ring talents. Most wrestlers were totally out of character. Goldust was Dustin Runnels, for example. Jarrett, doing an angle with Deborah, talked openly about his own wife and marriage. Mankind talked about how Owen was his kid's favorite wrestler. Mark Henry cried heavily while reading a poem. Certainly the ones who stole the show, so to speak, were Road Dogg, Mankind, Jarrett, Deborah and Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler at the end of the show. Shane McMahon spoke for the company as Vince never spoke during the show. Neither Austin nor Rock did speaking tributes, being held off until the very end of the show, and Undertaker never appeared, as apparently they didn't want him seen out of character. Almost all, with one or two exceptions, wrestlers on the show wore black armbands with Owen or O on it. On Nitro the same night, Chris Benoit, who broke in with Stampede Wrestling a few months before Owen and whose careers in their early stages paralleled, and who actually inside the ring became the performer that everyone expected Owen would wind up being, and Roddy Piper, a longtime family friend, also wore the armbands. In many ways it would qualify as tremendous television, but they totally avoided any details of trying to answer the questions the public would have had over how and why this happened, although admittedly no answer can be sufficient, and at least explain why decisions were made that the entire world was asking about all day long on talk shows and news shows. The continued hype of keeping the appearance of the big stars like Rock and Steve Austin for the final few minutes was a concession to typical ratings ploy on a night where everyone knew in advance due to all the publicity that the ratings would be record-breaking no matter what was done. There were many people who thought the final 5 minutes, in particular having Austin, who had been so vociferous since late 1997 about hating Hart and had told many people over the years that he thought Hart hurt him deliberately, and had some Hart family members upset with his comments on Owen in Rolling Stone. Doing a beer tribute did come off as something designed more to get the company over than something based in sincerity. The show drew the highest competitive rating in the history of the Monday Night Wars, a 7.14 rating to Nitro's 3.77. More Americans watched wrestling that night than at any time since the days of the Saturday night's main event. Unlike the typical wrestling reaction to a death, the salute and never mentioning it again, Nitro had the salute to Hart at the beginning and 2 or 3 references during the show, although nobody spoke of Hart during their interview. The same day they were heavily advertising something of a wrestling doubleheader that tremendous hype was attached to, with a plan for Nitro to build up the ratings for a Tonight Show match with Kevin Nash versus Bret Hart. While we don't have this confirmed, we know that Bret was on an airplane en route to Los Angeles on Sunday night from Ottawa, where he attended the Calgary Hitmen playoff game. He apparently didn't have his cell phone on, and didn't receive word until he landed several hours after the incident, and we believe Bischoff met him and he immediately flew back to Calgary. The entire Tonight Show segment was cancelled with Jay Leno talking about the incident and wishing his best to Bret and the family. Craig Kilborn on CBS wasn't nearly as classy, telling a joke that night talking about how the Blue Blazer had died yesterday at a wrestling match but the white turtleneck is still alive. A regular television taping took place the next night in Moline, Illinois, after which the entire crew was sent home until a June 5 show in Springfield, Massachusetts. The live event scheduled for May 26 in Peoria, Illinois, May 27 in Winnipeg, May 28 in Hamilton, ONT May 29 in Montreal and May 30 in Ottawa were all postponed and will be rescheduled, with some of the cities attempting to be rebooked in early July. McMahon also informed all the wrestlers that the company was going to fly them and in many cases their spouses to Calgary for Hart's funeral on May 31. It was a sharp contrast to the funeral of Brian Pillman, at which not one WWF wrestler or administrator attended even though it was on an off day in the schedule. Vince McMahon and Jim Ross did attend the wake the previous night. The family was on one major network show after another all week, looking as one would expect, exhausted and heavily grieving. Martha and Bret both spoke on different shows about the direction wrestling has taken and were hopeful this would be a wake-up call. On the various shows I was asked to be part of, that was always the question. Only time will tell. None to this point have been. But this was something of an entirely different magnitude. For both of us, there was deep concern about the safety, definitely, said Martha, 33, to the Canadian press. Martha and Owen were set to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary and it had been 17 years since they started dating on July 1. They had built a dream house in the country that Owen was going to retire to, that they were scheduled to move into this coming week. The couple had 2 children that were talked about on the Raw broadcast, Oye, 7, and Athena, 3. He was going to spend the rest of his time with his children, and his wife, said Ellie. He saved every dime he ever made in wrestling. He was one of the best amateur wrestlers in the world and he loved it. But he was fed up with the direction wrestling was taking in New York and was ready to retire. My poor brother Owen was a sacrifice for the ratings. That's how I look at it. I believe it's a serious wake-up call. For years, there were 2 pro wrestling families more famous than any other, the Von Erichs out of Texas, who wound up with tragedy of Herculean proportions, and the Harts. Unlike the Von Erich tragedies, which were inevitable and predictable although no less freakish, the Harts have had far more than their own share of terrible luck. In 1990, either the day before or the day of the Survivor Series, Owen's older brother Dean died at the age of 36 due to Bright's disease, a form of kidney failure. There are bitter scars almost never talked about involving Bret and Vince McMahon from that incident because McMahon didn't want him to go home when he got the word of the death until after the show. Even more publicized, on July 4, 1996, Matt Annis, one of virtually every one of the nieces and nephews who called Owen their favorite uncle, the son of B.J. Annis, who wrestled briefly in the 80s for Stampede and ran a local gym, and Georgia Hart, who wanted to grow up to be the wrestler Owen was and grow up to form a tag team with Harry Smith, Davey and Diana's son, died at the age of 13 of a rare flesh-eating disease. The family was together for their traditional Sunday morning brunch at the famed Hart House just 1 week before this tragedy, sharing a moment of silence since it would have been his 16th birthday. Dave Stubbs, a former WWF referee and current sports editor at the Montreal Gazette, wrote this on May 25. That the show continued proved what everyone already knew. The whole of this mighty machine is bigger than any one of its parts, dead or alive. A cornerstone employee, one of the WWF's most popular performers, is carried out of the arena dying, perhaps even deceased, and the show unconscionably goes on. It was a nauseating disrespect that this week's 4-show Canadian tour postponement cannot undo. In response to fans' lust for hardcore action, it's become a far more violent and dangerous career for its performers. The feeling among more than one athlete has been, what's it going to take to stop this, for someone to be killed? Those quiet voices, who play this wild game by the promoter's rules or find work elsewhere, will learn that it will take much more than that. For a few days, professional wrestling will mourn the untimely passing of a good man and a talented entertainer. And then it will again tear off its blouses to expose its brassieres, encourage delinquent behavior and draw blood with folding metal chairs and garbage pails. The insane stunts, like a few arena shows, will not be cancelled, only postponed. Owen Hart's premature demise was entirely preventable, and regrettably, the business that was his life and his death will learn nothing from it. That is the greatest tragedy of all. It's not that this week isn't, by normal standards, filled with huge news stories. The WWF signed a deal for a 2-hour weekly Thursday night show from 8 to 10 p.m. on UPN starting in late August and is totally revamping the way it does its touring schedule. The plan is to cut way back on traditional house shows, and company will become almost a touring television promotion. The plan is to run traditional house shows every Saturday night and every other Sunday, with the alternate Sunday being a heat or pay-per-view/heat show. Raw will go live every Monday, and the UPN special, called SmackDown, will be taped every Tuesday for a Thursday showing. At this point, the status of running events on Fridays, either all the time or some of the time, is still under consideration. The WWF also has expressed interest in going public, with the McMahon family hoping to raise in the neighborhood of $150 million by selling of 20% of the company stock, so they'll get a gigantic cash payoff but still maintain a controlling interest. There has been a lot of media talk that it's going to happen, but we're told it's something being considered and probably wouldn't happen for a few months. Several television business shows brought that up in the wake of Owen's death and said it would probably delay getting this done by a few months, and the reputation the company garnered from what happened would hurt them a little, at least if they went on the market now. The Brian Pillman Memorial Show on May 19 raised $35,100 for the Family Fund. Rick Steamboat, 46, who was at the show, said that his back has been in constant pain since retiring in 1994 due to the injury. He said he feels his body could endure one last great match and would like to do it against Flair, but there is no way he could go back and wrestle on a regular basis. Flair did a mock good-natured angle with Steamboat in the ring at the show. Bill Goldberg's last angle before knee surgery was scheduled as making the save for Nash on the Tonight Show match on May 23 after Nash was double-teamed by Savage and Bret Hart. The entire Tonight Show segment was cancelled, and there is no rescheduling planned. Sable is in the midst of a major contract dispute with WWF. I can't tell you what Sable is making for these Playboy shoots, but it is a good deal of money, but nowhere close to the figures people have been throwing around. There were 2 other deaths of wrestling personalities from the past this past week. Boyd Pierce, a legendary figure in Texas and Oklahoma, passed away on May 18 at the age of 70. Known for his loud suits and folks' demeanor, Pierce was one of those men who seemed to be a charming friend to everyone who had met him while working as a television announcer, first in Texas and later in Oklahoma. Pierce is the answer to the trivia question as to who Jim Ross replaced as host of Mid-South Wrestling. Johnny Eagles, 64, passed away from a heart attack at his home in Tigard, Oregon on May 12. Eagles had been having heart trouble on and off for nearly 2 decades and died while undergoing coronary bypass surgery. Eagles began his career in England in 1954 after studying shooting at the famed Wigan Academy Snake Pit, which is where people like Carl Gotch, Billy Robinson and Steven Regal learned the real stuff. He wrestled in Europe and Africa through 1971, when he first came to North America and worked for Leroy McGurk and later worked Tennessee under the name Johnny Eagles Marlin, as the supposed cousin of Eddie Marlin. He later wrestled as a prelim guy in San Francisco before moving to Portland in 1975, where he wrestled until 1980 with the gimmick of the Houdini of wrestling, with a unique ability to escape from every hold put on him through decoy maneuvers learned in Europe. His career ended after a heart attack and he's suffered several over the past 19 years, most of which was spent working selling cars. Nitro wasn't much. There was considerable legit heat between Bischoff and a lot of the wrestlers for legit deviating from his script on Monday in promos where they openly knocked the direction of the company and holding the young guys back, in particular Disco Inferno Buff Bagwell, Hugh Morris, and Dean Malenko. Bischoff and Malenko had a heated confrontation after a live angle where Malenko said that you have to show you're over 45 on your driver's license to get a push in WCW. Hogan returned, on crutches, on the show. Benoit and Malenko turned on Flair and did a six-man teaming with Piper against Flair and Page and Bigelow, which ended with an outside interference no contest when Saturn and Raven attacked Page and Bigelow. Raven is out of action from the house shows with an apparent rotator cuff injury, which may be a tear. Malenko suffered a back injury last week, and it got worse in Cincinnati working the Pillman show, and got so bad in Roanoke that he couldn't work the house shows the next 2 nights and didn't even dress for his match, where he barely got in the ring, at Nitro. Charles Robinson was hospitalized again later this week when his lung collapsed to 40%. He was scheduled to return at Nitro and do a gimmick where he was hooked up to an oxygen tank to sell the actually legit injuries from Savage dropping the elbow on him. Axl Rotten and Chris Candido were back working for ECW this past weekend in Michigan despite Paul Heyman saying they were fired. The story is that Rotten's grandmother passed away and he felt it would be the wrong time to fire him due to that, and they are going to do a series of hardcore matches with Rotten versus Balls Mahoney using thumbtacks, barbed wire, fire and tables to get Mahoney over as the new hardcore star with New Jack's status questionable due to his trial for assault from the Eric Kulas incident starting this week. Candido did a quick job for Taz in Detroit. According to Paul Heyman, he claims ECW owed Candido no money and the most they ever owed him was $23,000 many months back and he was paid back in 4 days when the figure got to that point. Heyman also said he has no interest whatsoever in bringing Shane Douglas back. Steve McMichael is currently in rehab. WCW is contemplating bringing back Steve Regal, but it's far from a done deal. WWF sold out the Target Center in Minneapolis for SummerSlam in 90 minutes. Vader has signed a 2-year deal with All Japan for $14,950 per week with the option of wrestling every show for 2 years if he chooses to. Vader has talked about retiring as a full-time wrestler when this deal is up, at which time he'd be 45, and perhaps do a retirement match at that point. Bradshaw and Steve Blackman did get into a fist fight at Baggage Claim before the Over the Edge show as acknowledged in the Raw commentary the next night. Kiyoshi Tamura won the Ring's world title from Bitsaid Terriel on May 22 in Tokyo with a choke in 9:19 in what was almost surely a worked match. Also in what is almost surely, because of the angle that went down, a worked match, Yoshihisa Yamamoto beat Tsuyoshi Kosaka via knockout in 15:41. Yamamoto was given the win because Rings and UFO, both struggling to draw, are going to work together starting August 19 in Yokohama where Naoya Ogawa will face Yamamoto as a probable build-up for matches against Kosaka and Tamura. Ogawa against guys from Rings should do some business. Due to problems finishing up on getting the visa, Ogawa's NWA tour didn't start this past week but will start May 28 in North Richland Hills, Texas, against Dan Severn. Owen Hart's death also made mainstream newspapers in both Japan and Mexico. Kurgan is now working in Mexico. Shima Nobunaga was brought in to work as a jobber. What a great eye for talent this company has, at the WCW Saturday night tapings on May 25. New Japan's Seiji Sakaguchi and Masa Saito came to the US this week to meet with Eric Bischoff. They want WCW to send them bigger names like Goldberg or they'll switch to doing business with WWF. All Japan has no interest in a business relationship with WWF. Mitsuharu Misawa appeared on TV Asahi New Japan's network, on Ring no Tamashi, a sports talk show. Since the wrestlers have exclusive deals with their networks, him just appearing on the New Japan network again shows just how close an interpromotional feud is. When Misawa asked who the best wrestler he ever faced was, he surprisingly said Chavo Guerrero Sr. Misawa said he wanted to wrestle Muto, Chono, and Hashimoto. When asked if he'd like to wrestle Alexander Karelin, he said that he'd like Akiyama, who was a good amateur, although nowhere close to Karelin's. 23 in Kansas City were Meat over Brian Christopher, Hardy Boys over Goldust and Meanie, Vince no contest Midian in a few seconds but Midian smashed his ankle with a chair, X-Pac and Kane beat Brown and Henry in a good tag title match, Snow beat Holly in a decent hardcore title match. At this point Hart died and even discussing the quality of any of the rest of the matches would be disrespectful. We're giving the show a thumbs up or down. Venice and Nicole Bass over Jeff Jarrett and Deborah, Billy Gunn over Road Dogg Mankind, Final Survivor. Won an elimination match with Big Show and Shamrock and Test over Bossman and Farouk and Bradshaw and Viscera. Rock beat Triple H via DQ when he hit the ref and Taker beat Austin for the belt when Shane fast counted him. Vince showed back up for the finish. Sorry for the brief news but because of so much news regarding Hart, This issue took far more time than usual to research and put together, and for a lot of reasons it's practically a miracle there even is an issue. At this point, it doesn't even seem appropriate this week to even talk about anything else like business and good matches and bad matches. The rest of this issue was already completed before Hart's death, and next week we'll catch up on news that was missed this week.